Francis Dearnley, The Telegraph. Mr. President, Russia has annexed regions in Ukraine it does not fully control. Is there any chance that as part of a peace deal, any territory could be given to Moscow, which is currently in Ukrainian hands? And what is your message to your people in the occupied territories?
Дякую за запитання.
Oh, thank you for the question.
I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Prime Minister Keir Starmer says we are at a crossroads in history, we assess the diplomatic fallout from Friday's disastrous Oval Office meeting, take in the view from Kyiv, and hear from Francis as he was present to interview President Zelensky on Sunday night.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 3rd of March, 3 years and 7 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by The Telegraph's executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley, and Christopher Miller, chief correspondent in Kyiv for the Financial Times. I started with the latest battlefield developments. So, very little movement over the weekend on the ground. The most notable thing was that Russia took back, or possibly Ukraine withdrew from, it amounts to the same thing, but we're not exactly sure what happened, the area of land on the western extreme of that lodgement Ukraine has inside Russia in the vicinity of Sudzha. Now, that remaining area of land out to the west was under threat since Russia cut the link to it last week, that it had been connecting it to the main defended position. Now, it has the border with Ukraine at its rear, so it was never going to be in danger of being surrounded. And although I've not seen any reports about exactly what happened, I would imagine any withdrawal, although in contact with the enemy, so that's never an easy task, but it should have been conducted in good order. And certainly we haven't heard any Kremlin crowing about it or about a massive rout, as would have been the case otherwise. Now, elsewhere, Russian forces struck a Ukrainian military training ground in the Dnipropetrovsk region on Saturday during a formation exercise. Mikhailo Drapachyy, he's the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, said this morning. General Drapachyy did not disclose the number of Ukrainian soldiers killed or injured, but said a tragedy at a training ground is a terrible consequence of an enemy strike. The war requires quick decisions, responsibility, and new safety standards. Otherwise, we will lose more than we have. Everyone who made decisions that day and everyone who did not make them on time will be held accountable. No one will hide behind explanations or formal reports. So, as he says, no details about casualties from that strike, but it does sound quite significant. And then finally, for the military updates, although not confirmed as a long-range Ukrainian drone strike, local authorities in Russia reported this morning that a large fire broke out last night at the Ufimsky oil refinery in the Russian city of Ufa. That's about 1,400 kilometers inside Russia. It's just north of Kazakhstan. Now, Russian telegram channels reported an explosion at the refinery before the fire broke out, and the Kyiv Independent, from where this reporting comes, could not verify those reports. Now, like I say, I want to move on to the diplomatic stories. The big story from the weekend was a continued political and diplomatic work, especially in the wake of Friday's disastrous Oval Office meeting. Britain's PM, Sir Keir Starmer, said yesterday that Europe stands at a crossroads in history, as he called on nations to step up to secure a lasting peace in Ukraine. Hosting 19 world leaders at an emergency summit in London, the Prime Minister said he and President Emmanuel Macron of France were assembling a coalition of the willing. Now, a new diplomatic term has been introduced that we all need to get ready for. This coalition is going to be called Europe Plus, because Canada and Turkey, or Turkey, as we should now be calling it, are involved in the discussions, possibly others too, plus non-governmental bodies like the EU and NATO. Turkey's involvement is particularly noteworthy. Yes, It's a NATO country, but straddles Europe and Asia, has a very large military, is not afraid to tell Putin to wind his neck in, such as in 2015. You may remember it shot down a Russian jet that had strayed into its airspace from Syria. But Keir also speaks to Russia and may be a future convener of peace talks. The country regulates the Montreux Convention, which regulates access to and from the Black Sea during periods of conflict. And Keir sees itself as a rising regional power. It has also, importantly, voiced support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. So I think it's very interesting that they are heavily involved with this. Bloomberg is reporting today that the plan is the UK and France's response to a series of private requests made by Donald Trump following Friday's public row with President Zelensky. Then at the summit yesterday, European leaders promised to rearm and are expected to announce major defence spending increases in the coming days, possibly as soon as Thursday, when EU leaders meet for a European Council summit in Brussels to discuss Ukraine and how to dramatically increase defence spending. That will be an interesting meeting, as the UK obviously is no longer a part of the EU, but has and is taking a central role in crafting this new European security architecture. And anyway, surely this whole issue is bigger than the EU, so I would expect Britain to be invited to that meeting. Back to yesterday, and Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, said Ukraine would be turned into a steel porcupine that could not be ingested by invading forces, while Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, declared that Europe has woken up. That's very good, but will it hit the snooze button, Mr. Tusk? Now, the summit was attended by President Zelensky, travelling back from Friday's chaotic fireside spat in the Oval Office. I know Marco Rubio, who clearly knows which side his bread is buttered, said the row had erupted because Zelensky had been Ukraine-splaining. That's a bit of a linguistic contortion. I prefer, as an explanation as to what went wrong, Vance rants. Oh, and I should say to anyone listening to this from the White House, thank you for listening. I know you like to be repeatedly thanked and have a very poor memory for how many times you have been thanked, so I'll just say it again. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Anyway, when Mr. Zelensky arrived in the UK, he was embraced warmly by Prime Minister Keir Starmer. On arrival, later on Sunday afternoon, travelled to Sandringham to meet King Charles in his trademark T-shirt and sweatpants. That's Zelensky, not the King. President Zelensky actually wore black trousers and I think a black vyshyvanka, the traditional embroidered Ukrainian shirt. Looks rather smart, I think. Earlier, at the Leaders' Summit at Lancaster House here in central London, just next to St James's Palace, Keir Starmer said, "We are at a crossroads in history today. This is not a moment for more talk. It's time to act, time to step up and lead and to unite around a new plan for a just and enduring peace." He said Europe would have to do the heavy lifting and provide a post-conflict force for Ukraine. Britain and France would lead that force if their troops had US security guarantees as a backstop to deter Russia, he said. Another quote from Keir Starmer said the United Kingdom should step up to lead. We've done that historically as a nation and we need to do it again. A number of countries have indicated today, as in Sunday, that they want to be part of the plan that we are developing. I'll leave them to make their own statements about exactly how they want to make that contribution, but we've been able to move that forward. Not every country will feel able to contribute, but those willing will intensify planning now with real urgency. The UK is prepared to back this with boots on the ground and planes in the air. Now, it's all been received pretty well in Europe, except for a potential gaffe whereby the Baltic states were not invited. Now, Keir Starmer spoke to the leaders of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania by video call yesterday, but I do wonder why they weren't there. It does seem to be a little bit of an oversight. Anyway, last night, President Macron told French newspaper Le Figaro that he and Keir Starmer had proposed an initial month-long truce between Russia and Ukraine, quote, in the air, at sea and on energy infrastructure. Now, the Financial Times are reporting this morning that Macron said this approach would have the advantage of verifying Russia's intentions and would be easier than overseeing a truce on the ground along the entire front line. Monsieur Macron said in the event of a ceasefire, it would be very difficult to verify that the front is being respected. Now, more on the view from the Financial Times shortly with today's guest, Christopher Miller. There's a lot more news, maybe not quite so headline grabbing, but worthy of note. So to quickly bring us all up to speed, please forgive the somewhat bullet point style of these next few updates, but I'll rattle through them. So Britain and Ukraine have signed a £2.26 billion bilateral loan agreement, the first time cash generated from frozen Russian assets will be used for military purposes. It's been used before for humanitarian purposes. This is the first time it will actually go towards military stuff. Britain's Chancellor Rachel Reeves will make billions more available for Ukraine by changing the remit of the £27.8 billion National Wealth Fund. That's a special fund set up by the British government to partner with the private sector and local authorities to finance mainly infrastructure projects such as green energy schemes. That also is now going to be made available to the defence sector. Next one. Somewhat eclipsed by the diplomatic events yesterday, the Prime Minister here also announced a £1.6 billion deal to supply 5,000 lightweight multi-role missiles to Ukraine. Now, these are advanced air defence missiles made by Thales in Northern Ireland. As an aside, when I saw this news, I wondered what the view is from the big US defence industrial primes, the Lockheed Martins and Northrop Grummons of the world, to Donald Trump's words and hints that will add impetus to Europe turning away from the US for its high-end capabilities. I note today that shares in British defence primes or BAE Systems jumped nearly 20% when trading open this morning, their biggest single-day jump on record. Engine maker Rolls-Royce, they do a lot of stuff in the defence world. Their share price rose nearly 7% to a new record high. And smaller, but still pretty massive defence industrial firms, Babcock International, Chemring and Kinetic, and some smaller defence firms like Avon Technologies and Cohort all saw healthy gains. Next one. Over the weekend, US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth ordered General Timothy Hoare, the head of the US's Cyber Command, to deprioritise threats from Russia. The Record, that's a specialist computer security website, said a new directive from Hegseth had ordered the nation's Cyber Command to halt planning to counter threats from Russia. Bloomberg is reporting today that the White House is split on how to handle Ukraine after Friday's row. One camp is said to prefer balance, while another is taking quote-unquote extreme positions against Mr. Zelensky and his country, Bloomberg UK says. Others expected Mr. Zelensky to resign once peace is achieved. That obviously is a key Russian request, spouted by many others. Mr. Trump is yet to make up his mind, according to this report, and wants the Ukrainian president to apologise and say he's ready for peace before signing the minerals deal. And then more fallout from Friday. CNN, citing undisclosed sources, reported yesterday that preparations for a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are now being fast-tracked. Next one. New York Times, also citing an undisclosed source, are reporting today that Donald Trump will discuss later on, as in later today, the possible suspension or complete cancellation of military aid to Ukraine, including weapons pledged by the Biden administration. The unnamed administration official told the New York Times that Donald Trump will meet Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and other top national security aides. Friday, blimey, what a show. City of Clowns. That's not a comment about Washington. I'm just noting Marie Davidson's new album, City of Clowns, was released on Friday. Check out Fun Times. It's a great track and it seems somewhat appropriate today. But otherwise, if you have 50 minutes spare, do watch the whole thing from Friday from the Oval Office. It was all going well until around the 46-47 minute point when a question from a Polish reporter sparked things off. Now, even the comment about President Zelensky not wearing a suit was made much earlier on in the fireside chat, and that was taken in very good grace. I do note that Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman wasn't criticised for not wearing a suit in the Oval Office, and nobody has said a word about Elon Musk wearing a T-shirt and a baseball cap, so I don't know what's going on there. Anyway, I don't know if the final row was premeditated, but I've been thinking about this. If Ukraine had driven a really hard bargain in the mineral deal, such that Mr. Trump, the deal maker supreme, hadn't got it over the line to his satisfaction and wanted to bring down the entire process whilst blaming someone else, this is what it would have looked like. It'll be interesting to see if the mineral deal ever does come back, and if so, whether the US position had hardened, in which case I think we will know that that was all staged. Then a couple more. Over the weekend, I saw J.D. Vance, Vice President, was subject to demonstrations when he went skiing in Vermont for a couple of days over the weekend. One placard I saw said, "Vance skis in his jeans." Now, please help me out here. Why is that an insult? Is it because he goes so slowly that he doesn't fall over? Certainly footage of him on the slopes reminded me of Bambi's first day on ice, but I've only ever known people who are brilliant at skiing to wear jeans because they're so confident they won't fall over. And these are normally the French guys with the big purple sun-damaged noses, smoking Gaulois and reeking of Jägermeister in the lift queues. Anyway, if you in the US know why that was an insult, please do let me know. And then finally for me, for now, just so you're aware, although I wouldn't give it too much of your attention, the Kremlin, responding to all these events over the last 48 hours, has said Western unity is falling apart over Ukraine. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said the fragmentation of the collective West has begun. Someone will have to make Zelensky want peace. If the Europeans can do it, they should be honoured and praised. He also said yesterday's London summit was not aimed at achieving peace. He said this clearly does not relate to a peace plan, but will allow for the continuation of hostilities, he told reporters. Right, let's file that one carefully. Now, I've done most of the political updates as we wanted to leave the room for Francis to talk specifically about the hastily arranged press conference held last night in Stansted Airport as President Zelensky left the UK after a Sunday's summit. So, Francis, you were one of a tiny pool of journalists invited. What happened?
Well, thanks, Dom. Yeah, it's been an extraordinary 24 hours. I got to bed last night at about 4 a.m, so forgive me if I sound a little bit frazzled. On Sunday, I got a call from the Ukrainians inviting me to a press conference, their words, at Stansted after Zelensky's meeting with the King. I thought it would be the usual crowded, chaotic affair where you're standing at the back with a microphone desperately trying to get a word in. But then when we arrived, we were told it was a private briefing of a very small select pool of journalists, so one can imagine my reaction. After passing security, we were given seats at a very small conference table. There were about 10 journalists in all. To give you a sense of occasion, one of the most seasoned industry veterans who I was sitting next to leaned over and remarked, "This may be the most important conference you and I will ever attend in our careers." Now, he's been doing this for over 40 years, so I could really have done with a stiff drink after that. Now, it was crammed with cameras and aeroplanes were roaring overhead, occasionally making the water in our glasses shake. Zelensky's plane was actually visible on the runway through the window. Now, when he entered, there was a collective inhale, an almost imperceptible pause, then nods of acknowledgement. It's strange when you meet somebody as famous as him because you do feel like you know him. You're in awe, but at the same time there's a strange relationship that's already been built. Now, he came and sat down directly opposite me, so I was within arm's length of him. Although if I tried anything, I would have been jumped by one of the security officers over his right shoulder. To our surprise, he appeared more relaxed than anticipated after what must have been a hellish week. But his answers were serious. This was not a man who was prepared to offer big concessions following that summit with Trump. The sole moment of discomfort came when he was asked if he would apologise to the American president. He rather deftly evaded the question after a long pause. Now, tellingly, throughout, he spoke almost entirely in Ukrainian, with us receiving a simultaneous translation, revealing in and of itself after Friday. I think I should say an underappreciated aspect of what took place on Friday is the simple point that Zelensky is not a fluent English speaker, which one could argue makes the attack by J.D. Vance all the more unfair, really. But what were my main takeaways from yesterday? Well, you'll hear my questions in a moment. But first, some quotations I hurriedly wrote down that the president said in the meeting. So just to start with the meeting with Trump on Friday, he said, "I had to protect the dignity of our warriors. It is their right to be free. It was important for me that the Ukrainian voice was heard. I did not want to be ambiguous. My words were not emotional. They were about justice, facts and truth. The deal will be signed if the parties are ready. Now then, another journalist pressed him on this and asked what happened immediately after that meeting. Was there another row that broke out in the back corridors? And he smiled and then he said, "I will leave that to future historians." So a lighter moment in the conference. Now, he then got into the US and a few interesting quotes he said there. He said some sort of presence of the United States is necessary. He said we can talk about forms, intelligence, sea, air, but I think our relationship will continue. We are grateful. We see the US as a strategic partner. Now, it was put to him whether Trump would block the military assistance, and he said the assistance coming from Congress was signed off some time ago. Stopping this would be helpful to Putin exclusively. A change in assistance for Ukraine from the US would mean changing the assistance for the whole of Europe. We are the front line. Now, just on that theme, Dominic Cummings, who was formerly a chief of staff of Downing Street under Boris Johnson, was tweeting this weekend that, and I quote, "The secret truths of the UK's very not independent nuclear deterrent is that it relies on massive US subsidies of money, materials and intellectual property." Hence why Cummings thinks that for all of Europe's posturing, ultimately it totally relies on the US and will fold. And I think that will be a critical question to consider over the coming weeks. How much leverage does Europe really have over Washington, given its own dependence on the United States for its own defence, let alone Ukraine's? Speaking of which, on security guarantees, I thought this was interesting. Zelensky said the best security guarantee is a strong Ukrainian army. He didn't talk about peacekeepers. Now that would speak to what you were just saying, Dom, about this porcupine strategy Ursula von der Leyen was relaying to journalists. That is one solution, of course, is that Ukraine is armed to the teeth as part of some kind of peace deal or ceasefire that would mean Russia would not invade again. I thought that was interesting. He emphasised that. He said we would need support from not only France and Britain. So again, a stress of it needing to be a broader coalition than just those two powers. When we pressed him on this, he said, "I don't want to talk about details. We are early in the talks." And that was something that happened again and again. He kept emphasising that we were early on. So putting cold water on the idea that some kind of ceasefire is imminent, I think. He then stressed, if we have a ceasefire, every day people will die. The Russians will claim we back a ceasefire. A ceasefire is not enough. It's a trap. Now, I thought that was noteworthy, given that Zelensky challenged the fact that Putin had signed previous ceasefires and then had been violated. And it was that which, of course, prompted Vance's interjection on Friday. So this is a consistent line from Zelensky that Putin breaks ceasefires. And it perhaps explains why he was so impassioned on this point on Friday. Now, as you were saying, Dom, some have called for Zelensky's resignation in the United States following what took place on Friday. He said, with regards to that, "To me, it will not be easy. You would need to stop me from participating in elections. I would do that in exchange for NATO membership. That would mean I fulfilled my mission." Now, I asked him about the occupied territories for reasons I'll explain in a moment. But first, let's hear those specific questions I put to him. Francis Dearnley, The Telegraph. Mr. President, Russia has annexed regions in Ukraine it does not fully control. Is there any chance that as part of a peace deal, any territory could be given to Moscow, which is currently in Ukrainian hands? And what is your message to your people in the occupied territories?
Дякую за запитання. Шансів, що ми своєю волею.
Oh, thank you for the question. There is no chance that we will voluntarily give anything away. Chances that we will legally recognize that. They are not existent. And this is not only because this is how we are, although without a doubt that is the case. It is because there is a law. And even if one country, like Russia, violates international law, it doesn't mean that others will accept it or support it. In other words, everyone understands that Ukraine will not recognize the occupied territories as Russian. We've been through this. I remember this whole path that we're going through today. We should base everything on the UN Charter and be based on understanding of international law by all partners, and based on the fact that the time will come and what is Ukrainian will return to Ukraine. Nobody wants anything extra. Nobody wants what doesn't belong to us. Because when you take something foreign or occupy something, and if you act against the law, all of this will come back to you. If you take someone's home, their land, your life will be taken. It's a matter of time. So there is nothing to discuss here.
Just one follow-up, if I may. You say no chance under your own volition of giving any territory away, but I wonder, is there any peace deal you could sign which would see territory go to Moscow that is not under control? You said not under your own volition, but is there any chance? Could you sign that deal?
Я думаю, що це ж не мирна угода тоді. Це, знаєте, як...
I think that's not a peace agreement, man. It's, like a forced division of land. It's a coercion that will turn into, I would say, it seems to me, a great risk of hostilities after some appropriate time. I think that the countries surrounding this war today and those that support us or want to act as mediators, they understand that if the war is ended unjustly, there will be a question of time when people will be restoring this justice.
То питання буде часу, коли люди будуть повертати цю справедливість.
Дякую.
Будь ласка.
Zelensky's response was unequivocal. Any peace deal that involved such concessions would not be a peace. It would be a forced capitulation. This is a crucial point, which is why I pressed him on it, because it's widely believed that Putin will never accept a peace agreement that does not cede entire regions he has annexed, inhabited by millions of Ukrainians, to Russia. So as much as Starmer may want to bridge the gap between Washington and Ukraine's allies, it is less a gap than a chasm. Zelensky is saying he cannot accept a peace deal which will see the annexed regions not under full Russian control be gifted to Moscow. But as things stand, the Kremlin will never accept a deal which will see those territories remain in Ukrainian hands. The Kremlin, after all, passed a law to make them, in their eyes, part of their own country's borders. And that is just one of the dozens of stumbling blocks which will make a meaningful peace deal not just a gargantuan task for diplomats, but near impossible. Certain fundamentals required for meaningful peace talks are simply not present. The distance between the parties is just too wide. And who really believes Putin will stop as he watches the chaos he's sowing in the West at the moment? Now, some suspect that Trump and Vance know this and just want to present a deal which will be rejected by the Ukrainians so they can blame Zelensky and then cut off all aid. Europe is desperate for that not to happen, but it may be beyond its power to change, weakened as it has been by decades of over-reliance on the US for defence and because of Trump's core beliefs about the origins of this war, which were on full display on Friday. Now, by the way, I just want to raise a point that was made by a friend of the podcast, former Congressman Adam Kinzinger, that peace is not peace. We keep using that term, but it is continued oppression in the occupied territories. Tortures, imprisonments, massacres, rapes, as we've been reporting on the podcast for years now. Just worth bearing that in mind. The language that we use matters. Now, before he left, Zelensky said, "I haven't the right to be depressed." Perhaps not, but many diplomats are, and it's hard to see that changing anytime soon. On a personal level, it was obviously an honour to be in the room with the president at such a historic moment. Very occasionally in life, one can feel the eyes of the world on a single place, and one feels the weight of time. I got to shake hands and share a few short words with him afterwards as well before he dashed off for his flight. It wasn't a game-changing press conference in terms of what we heard, but perhaps that is revealing in and of itself. Just a few other loose thoughts before we get to Chris, if I may, Dom. I found it, like you, rather curious to see the Baltic states not invited to the summit this weekend. Is it perhaps because they're considered too hawkish and there is hesitancy about being too hawkish at the moment as the Europeans try to bring the Americans back into the fold? I wonder, but it is a curious decision. Another is, I think we now have a definitive, unshakable answer to the question of whether Rubio, Waltz and Kellogg have any clout over the president or whether they are largely mouthpieces appointed for their loyalty. All three of them congratulated the president for encountering Zelensky on Friday in the way he did, in the strongest possible terms, despite the fact that Rubio looked so uncomfortable throughout the entire spectacle. We might have known that for a while now, along with many, many other things, but Friday confirmed all of them unequivocally, and that should sharpen our minds, and it clearly has in Europe.
Thank you, Francis. Really appreciate that. Amazing stuff. I look forward to hearing more later. Interesting point you make there about would the Baltic states be considered too hawkish? I really hope that is not the case by the rest of Europe. It was thought that one of the reasons Kaja Kallas did not get the NATO Secretary General job was because she was considered by the Biden White House to be too hawkish on Russia. I really hope that hasn't played a factor here. I mean, Mark Rutte is a good chap saying the right things, but worth noting that when he was Prime Minister of the Netherlands never met NATO 2% spending target. So that's not an accusation you can level certainly at Estonia under Kaja Kallas. So very interesting. I don't know what was happening there. But anyway, delighted now to welcome Christopher Miller, chief correspondent in Kyiv for the Financial Times. Christopher, I've long been a fan of your reporting, and as such, I had hoped to prepare a really clever set of questions for you. But like most people, I'm somewhat punch drunk right now, and not in a good way. So I will just say, welcome to the pod. And Christopher, what the hell is going on?
Well, good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you for having me back on. Yeah, that's a very good question. What the hell is going on? You didn't leave me too much to say. You guys covered quite a few bases there. But I guess I can tell you that is very much the question that Ukrainians themselves are asking. They're looking for answers in Washington, in London, in Paris. They're looking for help from those who they deem to be their staunchest allies. And right now they're deeply concerned about what is happening in Washington. They are very, very worried about the lack of a consensus in Europe about just how to approach the support for Ukraine. There seem to be a few leaders in a few countries that want to take the lead, but there's no agreement yet on how to proceed, and if proceeding is doing so with or without the United States on board. The other thing that the Ukrainians are very worried about is the rhetoric from the Trump team, the words that are coming out of the mouths of Vance and Trump, but also the director of national intelligence. These are U.S. government officials, our leadership in America, that are pushing lines that could have come straight from Kremlin talking points. It's deeply concerning, and we're hearing things from Tulsi Gabbard, for example, about questioning Zelensky's legitimacy, piling on pressure on Zelensky to make concessions, to come to the negotiating table. Well, no one's really piling pressure on Putin, it seems. That's, of course, very, very worrying. And certainly to the Ukrainians and to those of us who've followed this war very, very closely and know Russia's history, and that it goes far beyond just the invasion of 2022, but as far back as 2014 in terms of its military aggression, that it has not really been tested in the way that I think the Ukrainians want it to be tested and pushed and pressured to end its war against Ukraine. Since we're talking about words, and you guys both said words matter, the policy in the US under the Trump administration now seems to be, and I was told this by some American diplomats who were concerned about it, that this is now a conflict. This is the conflict in Ukraine. This is how the Trump administration is now describing what's happening, rather than Russia's war on Ukraine or against Ukraine, or even something like the Russo-Ukrainian war, Russia-Ukraine war. That just, to me, really gives me a sense that they're trying to normalize relations with Russia. They view it much less as an adversary, and instead they're taking this really adversarial stance towards Ukraine, which is just shocking. But if you are in Kyiv these days, it's really, really worrying, because they know it will maybe not be impossible, but extremely difficult to continue their defense against a extremely large and determined military if the US is not involved.
Thank you. Now, in your experience as a seasoned sort of foreign affairs observer, reporter, there's been so much happening in the last few months, but in particular the last 2 weeks, and especially over the weekend, for all the reasons we've just been discussing. So do you see this sort of historically as diplomatic chaos, or as the necessary pace of activity given the challenge of this war? And is this just the art of the deal, the way these things are being positioned? Or is it unhelpful and potentially dangerous politicking, do you think?
Well, I think it's Trump's way of making a deal, right? But I don't see any aspect of the American proposed deal that is good for Ukraine. I'm yet to hear or see anything from the Trump team that is applying pressure on Russia to get it to come to the negotiating table and make concessions. To be clear, I mean, have the aggressor of this war and the side who invaded actually make concessions here, right? Instead, it's not being punished in any way that I've seen in the American proposals or the Trump deal. This is certainly historic. I think the speed at which all of this has unfolded over the past week is astonishing and not in Ukraine's favor. I think the Ukrainians would much prefer to slow things down. President Zelensky has been pretty clear, and we saw it on display in this disastrous White House meeting, him trying to explain that you can't just force Ukraine and Russia to come to the table, sit across from each other, and just say, okay, we're going to stop this war now, and expect that Russia's going to say, you know what, President Trump, you're right, it's time to end this thing. We'll just go ahead and do that now. There are many things that need to be taken into consideration. This is a process that really lacks but needs a roadmap. The Americans rather appear to be jamming down the Ukrainians' throats this deal, although I hesitate to call it a deal or anything of that sort, because there isn't really a plan. The Zelensky team, who I've been in very close contact with over the last few weeks about all of this, has said, you know what, we really do lack a plan. The Americans have not said what they would actually like to do. We're trying to get them to discuss and agree to steps, including a ceasefire, but that isn't necessarily the first step. What they would like, of course, are commitments to flood Ukraine with weaponry, or to make that part of a deal that could see the flow of weapons into Ukraine begin if Russia is to break a ceasefire. They want some kind of security guarantee of assistance, future assistance, that will prevent or deter Russia from invading again. Instead, what Trump seems to want, and I think he's actually been very clear on this, is a ceasefire for the sake of a ceasefire. And something I thought was overlooked a week ago during Zelensky's marathon press conference in Kyiv is him saying, you know what, I believe that President Trump believes that a ceasefire is the end of the war. And that, to me, it really sums up what we're seeing and hearing from Trump. And he himself said, I believe it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, during one of these sort of ad hoc press conferences in the Oval Office, when asked about Ukraine and what needs to be done, and I forget the exact way the question was worded, but his response when asked what he wanted to happen was, I just want it to stop. It just has to stop. I don't care how it stops, right? That might be a crude way of paraphrasing it, but it's exactly what he said, which is he does not really care how the war ends. He just wants it to stop. Now, to me, that's, of course, very worrying, right? Because we want a lasting peace here. We want a ceasefire that sticks. We want justice for the atrocities that have been carried out on Ukrainian soil by Russian soldiers. And it certainly doesn't appear to be any part of America's plan for ending this thing right now.
Yes, gloomy. Thank you. Last one from me. Donald Tusk says that Europe has woken up, and we all need to update our bingo cards, because we are hearing this phrase lasting and durable peace over and over again now. I think it's becoming the new as long as it takes. Surely lasting and durable say the same sort of thing, and neither of them say very much if you don't back it up. So I'm a bit concerned about how many politicians are now talking about lasting and durable peace and leaving it at that. But is this just language? We've got this French idea, or Franco-British idea. I think it was mainly President Macron with this idea for a month-long truce in the air and at sea. Do you think is this diplomatic smoke and mirrors masquerading as meaningful action, or are these actually sensible ideas, pushing the agenda forward, keeping the momentum going?
It is some of the latter. No, I won't completely discount these things. Durable, I think, speaks to strength. Lasting meaning in terms of time, right? We want both. We want to see a lasting peace, and we want to see a durable one. By that, my understanding is strengthening Ukraine to the extent in which the West can. I think some of these ideas are good ideas. I do worry that we're still underestimating what it will take to create a durable peace. I still don't see anyone talking about or agreeing on at least how to apply pressure on Russia to get it to the negotiating table. Why does Russia need to go to the negotiating table right now? I really do think it's just stringing the Americans along. It feels as though it's certainly, if not in a great place, because the Russian military faces its slew of challenges as well, it's certainly comfortable in the position it's in. The Kremlin just said this week that it's been surprised at how aligned it has become with the new Trump administration, right? All the pressure is being applied on Kyiv here, none on Russia. I think what's being discussed in Europe now is good. I think the discussion of security forces is good. I still think we're underestimating what is going to be needed to actually secure that peace. And those are certainly talks that are going to be happening over the course of the next few weeks. But on the ceasefire, this 1 month ceasefire, I find that to be problematic, not least because it's being pushed for Ukraine to unilaterally declare it, right? To show or prove that it wants to bring this thing to an end, which of course we already know it does. But again, nobody's pushing Russia into this. And then we know Russia's record on ceasefires. It's very poor. There's not a single ceasefire it's stuck to since the war began in 2014. Why is it going to stick to a ceasefire now, especially when there's so little pressure on it, right? And then another thing I thought of was this month, ceasefire, what is it, air, sea, right? This is a month in which Russia is going to be able to produce a number of ballistic missiles, drones, other weaponry that it can use at the end of that month. What are we going to give Ukraine in that month? Is the West going to flood Ukraine with interceptor missiles for Patriots, for other air defense systems? If not, what we're going to see at the end of this month, ceasefire, or whenever it is inevitably broken, is Russia likely bombarding Ukraine with an even larger number of missiles and drones. And it's already been stepping up its aerial attacks, we know, from the last few weeks in record numbers. And so what we could face after a month ceasefire is a return to all-out war and massive bombardments of Russian missiles and drones. So they're really going to have to think through what this month is for. And if it is for ramping up supplies to Ukraine, then great, that could help. That month, while we worry that it would allow Russia to regroup and rearm, we could also, in the West here, allow that time to be used to give Ukrainian troops rest, to regroup, and to flood weapon systems into Ukraine at the same time.
Christopher, it's Francis. Always a pleasure to hear your reflections. Just on that theme, I'm interested in whether in the conversations you've had with the Ukrainians, there is a sense of optimism at the prospect of what Europe would be capable of doing without the United States if the worst were to happen. You spoke there about the prospects of potentially weapons being funneled in if there were the impetus, if perhaps there was this month-long truce of some ilk. But I wonder, have they thought through what that would mean? And would they, in a sense, be saying, well, we'll fight on. As long as we've got Europe, we'll fight on, because at some point Russia's going to blink. I'm just wondering if you've heard anything on that subject.
Yeah, I have discussions with Ukrainians on a probably daily basis on this. I think it's an extremely resilient, determined nation. And I think if all of their allies were to withdraw right now and they were still facing the existential threat that they are now, I think Ukrainians would fight on. I wouldn't question that. We've seen them time and time again over the years do extraordinary things with very little or no help at all from the outside and their allies. I think they understand that without the Americans, it will be very, very difficult, to put it mildly, to carry on for an extended period of time. They really, really need Europe to get its act together. And that means not only providing what they can at the moment, but ramping up production of weapon systems and putting together a longer term plan for their own countries and European security that involves Ukraine, and also which utilizes what is available in Ukraine. And by that, I mean the million-strong army that Ukraine has built, its skills on the battlefield, its drone technologies, its production of those. This should be a two-way street, not a one-way street. And I think there should be more discussion about that. And certainly that's what the Ukrainians want. They're under no illusions, though, again, that they can defeat Russia without America. That is highly unlikely. What they're hoping for is to get the Trump team on board, and if not, to provide security guarantees through boots on the ground or even the continued flow of weapons systems, just to try to build this, another word that we've been hearing a lot of lately, right, is this backstop to essentially support what Europe is putting together in terms of security guarantees.
Interesting. And of course, you are chief correspondent in Kyiv for the Financial Times. So my last question is going to be financial, if I may, which is, what are you hearing about the $330 billion worth of frozen Russian assets? Of course, President Zelensky and many others who are supportive of him have called for those to be seized by European powers and used to fund the war and to fund these weapons, which of course are vastly expensive. Why has that not happened? Have you heard anything more on any movement on this subject?
Very little. Very little in terms of movement, unfortunately. Certainly, it is one of the things that the Ukrainians and President Zelensky himself is pushing. They're also taking this to the Trump team and saying, look, if you can help get this across the line, right, we won't have to rely so heavily on you all for assistance here. There are, and I know you guys have discussed them on your podcast before, many reasons why this has been held up. There's just no consensus yet across Europe about whether or not these can or should be used. But this is absolutely one of the key things that Ukraine is pushing. It will absolutely continue to do that, especially as conversations over the cost of assisting it continue.
Let us start drawing to a close now. If we get a final thoughts, please. Francis, can I start with you?
Thanks, Dom, and thanks, Chris, for your time today. Amid the maelstrom of daily reporting, yesterday evening being a case in point, it can be doubly easy to lose perspective. So I've been trying to ground myself by continuing to read history books. I'm still working my way through Churchill's war memoirs, and I've turned again to Christopher Clark's magisterial Sleepwalkers on the origins of the First World War for his insights into diplomacy. But it's got me thinking. One of the questions raised today by the American withdrawal from Europe under Trump is whether it is possible to bear real power and be secure without being part in the modern world of some kind of empire, in the broadest possible definition of that word. An overarching federal entity which is capable of a strong, unified power projection. Some of the architects of the European Union have seen that as being the organisation's role long term. For Europe, currently, it just doesn't have that. And we are seeing the possible weaknesses of that if the United States is no longer part of a shared alliance of values. So the question is, how can Europe count in the 21st century without the United States, if indeed that's the path we're going down? Interestingly, many thinkers in the 1880s were already pondering this in light of the inevitable success of the United States after the Civil War. It is why some British politicians were so concerned about the end of the British Empire. They believed that the second half of the 20th century and beyond would be about powerful blocs shaping the world. The Soviet Union, the United States, and one day, China. So how can Europe possibly compete without more integration, which gives it power? That is the central question of the moment. Some will answer it's an EU army, or even a more integrated Europe politically. But for many, that is utopian and ahistorical, given the reality of the divisions in Europe and the histories which go back so far. Perhaps the only way that would be possible is if Europe felt itself militarily threatened, existentially, perhaps even from the United States. I don't have an answer, by the way, I'm just pondering this question. But clearly, without the United States, if European powers want to continue having a vital role in world affairs, because no single power is strong enough anymore to have that weight, there's going to have to be a significant shift to take place. What form that might take, I don't know, because there is understandably great degrees of scepticism about political integration in Europe. But perhaps we are seeing the first contours form at the summits that have taken place recently, with conversations around coalitions of the willing, that in certain forms, particularly military, form to still have power in a world of vast power blocks. As I say, some might describe them modern takes of empires. This is a challenge Europe has not faced, arguably, in its history, at least not for 1,000 years. So we are truly in unprecedented times.
Thanks, Francis. Now, I'm going to close this episode today with a love letter from me to America. So although it's normally the guest's prerogative to offer the final thought, I'm going to snaffle that, I'm sorry. Now, it may be a bit rude, but maybe I've been watching too much White House TV. Anyway, Christopher, thank you for coming on today. Really appreciate your time. What would you like to leave our listeners with?
Thank you, guys. No, it's always a pleasure. I'll say this. I've been deeply disturbed by my country, the United States, shift toward Russia and Russian narratives when it comes to Ukraine. And I think I would just like to maybe recommend some things to read. On the road at the moment, I'm traveling outside of Ukraine and taking a short break, and I've brought with me a book of poetry by the Ukrainian poet Oksana Maximchuk. It's called Still City. And it's thin, it's pocketable, but it's deeply moving, very, very powerful. And I think we would all do well to read works by Ukrainian authors at this moment in time, or at this juncture in the war, when people seem to be aligning more with the side of the aggressor rather than the victim here. And this book paints a really intricate, detailed, painful picture of just what Ukrainians have gone through. And there are other books that have done the same. Alexander Mikhed's book, Language of War. This is one book that has been translated from the Ukrainian to English. There are many others. So I guess I would just make a pitch to go out. And I've written a book myself, but I would say we should be going out and buying this growing work of Ukrainian literature that's now being translated into English and is available for us so that we can better understand the Ukrainian perspective. Again, just to reiterate why that I think that's important is so much of what I've been hearing from my own country now and our administration is so sympathetic toward Russia and rather disturbing in that it doesn't reflect the reality. And so I think we can learn more about the reality by reading the works of these terrific and talented Ukrainian authors.
Thanks, Christopher. Now, as I said, for my final thought, I'd like to read a love letter to America. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, so please take it as such. I just wanted to get a few thoughts off my chest about the direction some in the United States would like to take us all. I'm going to end the space straight after, so I'll say thanks now to Francis, and thank you to Christopher, and thank you for listening, especially if you're in the White House. Thank you. Thank you. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. But for now, dear America, I'm sending you this letter because if I'd called on the phone, your head, which is currently ruling your heart, may have insisted you hang up when you heard what I'm going to say. Your heart is good, so it is to your head that I now speak. You can stop reading this letter, of course, but I know you and you know me, so we both know you will return to it when you've calmed down and retrieved this crumpled page from somewhere near the waste paper bin, or the trash can, as you insist on calling it. I love you, America. That's not in doubt. But right now, I don't think I like you very much. I may have taken advantage of you at times. I may have indulged myself and explored strange passions, all while benefiting from your vigilance. I was not the only one. But that alone does not explain why, in recent years, you have become a vision of what I know you detest: a bully, someone who is perpetually angry, unsure of themselves, somebody in retreat. What are you in retreat from? And where will this anger lead you? If, as I fear, you are retreating from yourself, from the change washing over you and your fellow Americans ushered in by the 21st century with its financial crashes and military defeats. Yes, we were defeated in Iraq. You will lose, because you can never outrun your shadow. I love the United Kingdom being a national village obsessed with potholes and faded glory. That's terrific, and I'm making a go of it. Be sure to buy a Buckingham Palace tea towel and some Highland shortbread on your way out of the gift shop. But the confidence I can just about squeeze from that self-deprecation is not you. You are the same as me, but different. We both love our flags. Yes, you may wave yours around a bit too much in public, risking that worst of all accusations as far as my reserved British sensibilities are concerned, that of making a spectacle of yourself. But then I'll often be guilty of flapping mine upside down and an incontinent display of manic celebration every time a Brit triumphs in cycling or rowing or any other nice city-downy sport. But we love our flags and we serve beneath them, going through the hard times together, intertwined and resolute. These colours don't run, as the old saying from Iraq went. I served alongside you in Iraq, and before that on operations in Europe on 9/11. I served alongside you in the Balkans, in Afghanistan too. I was served alongside you in Hooters in Jacksonville, but that's a story for another day. The point is, we've eaten the same dirt, stood up to the same bullies, and saluted our dead together. But still, we are different. You were forged by the idea that those who seek to vindictively expand their areas of interest should be opposed. You rejected the notion that those who do not care that their unconstrained ambition causes harm for others are swell guys. They are not. The British Empire in America was not. You do not need to retreat from yourself, from your friends, or from the world. It serves you ill to actively seek division in the name of negotiation, to punch down in order to assert your authority. In the darkest days of the Second World War, Churchill was said to have weaponized the English language and sent it into battle. You are blunting your words, and you debase free speech by holding insults to be great oratory. You are not the Americas. You are the United States of America, united, accepting and celebrating different perspectives and capabilities, not searching for points of difference with which to beat the other side. How can I look up to the city upon the hill when I have to watch out for the stones and the muck that is being thrown from it? So what am I saying? I'm not perfect. Why should you listen to a word of this or read it once you've stomped over to the trash can? It's because I'm your friend. I love you, I miss you, and right now I think you're hurting just a little bit more than I am. Have a chat with the guy in the mirror and remember how great you already are. Don't let others tell you you're not and need to be made so again. I'll be here when you're ready for a Coors Light or a beer. These colours don't run. Your friend, Dom.